speak that name. I brought this curse back to our family.
When I first heard that Tubi was releasing a new original horror film rooted in Korean culture, my mind immediately jumped to a very specific place. I assumed Death Name would revolve around the well-known superstition of writing someone's name in red ink. That belief has haunted Korean folklore for generations, so it felt like an obvious hook. But that assumption turned out to be completely wrong. Before we begin, would you please support me? Subscribing is free and very important to me. Please subscribe for better analysis and more videos. Director Ray and writer Regina Kim take Death Name in a far more unexpected direction. And while it doesn't rely on that familiar superstition, the film still stands out as one of the more original and ambitious titles in Tubi's rapidly expanding horror catalogue. At its core, Death Name is about identity, about inheritance, and about what happens when you dig into a family history that was intentionally buried for survival. The story follows Sophie Park, a Korean-American woman who has spent most of her life feeling disconnected from her cultural roots. She's played by Amy Kume, whose performance quietly carries the entire film. Sophie's distance from her heritage wasn't accidental, it was engineered. Her grandmother made sure Sophie and her mother never learned Korean. Assimilation wasn't just encouraged, it was enforced. Even Sophie's name was stripped of its Korean counterpart. Or at least, that's what Sophie believed for most of her life. That belief is what shatters the moment she begins researching her family lineage. And that's where Death Name reveals its true strength. This isn't a horror story driven by a made-up curse or a vaguely defined supernatural threat. Instead, the film roots its terror in real Korean history, generational trauma, and the consequences of erasure. The supernatural element exists, but it's secondary. The real horror lies in what was done, what was hidden, and why it was considered necessary. Going into the film, I had another expectation. I worried that Death Name might somehow resemble Death Note. For anyone unfamiliar, Death Note is a manga and anime series centered around a notebook used to kill people by writing their names. Thankfully, that fear was completely unfounded. This film has nothing to do with that concept. In fact, Death Name feels unlike almost anything currently circulating in the horror space. With the exception of something like Final Destination Bloodlines, there's very little out there that shares its tone or intent. The surface similarities are minimal. Asian American characters, a supernatural presence, generational trauma. But where other films invent mythology, Death Name digs into real history and lets that history become the monster. Sophie is a deeply relatable protagonist, especially for anyone who has ever felt cut off from their ancestry. Kume portrays her as reserved but emotionally restless. There's a quiet frustration beneath everything she does, like she's always felt incomplete without knowing why. As Sophie gets closer to the truth, the film makes one thing painfully clear. Reconnecting with the past isn't healing by default. Sometimes it hurts more than staying ignorant ever did. And that pain doesn't just affect the present, it reshapes the future. That idea sits at the heart of Death Name. On a thematic level, the film is refreshing. It's rare to see a horror movie centered on authentic Asian history rather than mythological shorthand. Since the early 2000s, most horror films touching on Asian culture have leaned heavily on folklore aesthetics without engaging with lived experience. Death Name doesn't make that mistake. Yes, there's a supernatural force at play, but the origin of the curse tied to Sophie's family is grounded in historical reality. That grounding gives the story weight. When the truth is revealed, it's not just scary, it's devastating. Unfortunately, where Death Name stumbles is execution. The cast, largely composed of Asian and specifically Korean actors, is commendable. Representation here feels intentional rather than performative, but the performances vary in quality. Amy Kume is consistently strong, growing more compelling as the film progresses. Others feel less certain, as if they're unsure whether they're in a drama or a horror film. That tonal confusion extends to the scares themselves. The horror elements often feel artificially layered on top of the narrative rather than emerging organically from it. You can sense that Ari and Kim had a very specific story they wanted to tell, and that story frequently takes priority over genre conventions. In theory, that's admirable. In practice, it means the film sometimes forgets to actually be frightening. There are scenes clearly designed to justify the horror label, but they lack impact. A few clumsy moments attempt to inject fear through imagery rather than meaning, and they don't land. Ironically, the backstory of Sophie's ancestral curse is far more disturbing than any jump scare the film attempts. That imbalance is frustrating because the film's ideas are genuinely strong. Death Name isn't interested in cheap thrills. It wants to explore how trauma is inherited, how silence can become a weapon, how names carry power far beyond identity, and how the act of reclaiming history can awaken forces that were suppressed for a reason. When the film leans into those themes, it works. When it tries to remind the audience that it's a horror movie, it falters. Still, despite its flaws, Death Name is easy to appreciate for what it's trying to do. It's unusual, it's thoughtful, and it's clearly made with care rather than cynicism. This isn't a perfect film. It has pacing issues, tonal inconsistencies, and horror elements that feel underdeveloped. But it also has something many genre films lack: a point of view. If you're willing to look past its rough edges, Death Name offers a story that lingers, not because it scares you in the moment, but because it forces you to think about what we inherit, what we erase, and what comes back when we try to remember. And sometimes, that kind of horror cuts deeper than anything supernatural. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments. This is where these kinds of films come to life. Until the next story, stay curious, be critical, keep your eyes on the screen, and remember, every film you haven't seen is a new film.